My name is Sarah Malone. I'm 36 years old, and 3 months ago, my wedding video reached 3 million views. But this story doesn't begin with my wedding, it begins with a phone call. The kind where you can hear the person on the other end rehearsing their words in the 2 seconds before they start speaking, which tells you everything about what's coming before a single syllable lands. My mother said, It's better if you don't come. You'd upset the energy. She was talking about my younger sister Cora's wedding. Cora was marrying a man named Prescott Halloway at a venue called Cedar Ridge Estate, the kind of place where they charge for the ice, and my mother, Patricia Malone, had decided I did not belong there. Before I tell you what happened next, take a moment to like and subscribe. And if you feel like it, tell me your city and what time it is where you are. I love knowing where these words travel. Now let me take you back to a Monday evening in February, to my kitchen, to the pot of soup I was making when my mother's name lit up my screen. The onions were caramelizing when the phone rang. Low heat, slow process, the kind of cooking that teaches patience. I had a dish towel over my shoulder and everything in its place. I considered not answering. My mother had a specific gift for calling at the precise moment something needed tending. Sarah, I need to speak with you about Cora's wedding. I turned the burner down. The kitchen smelled like thyme and browned butter, and the particular warmth of a meal taking shape. Cedar Ridge is a very specific kind of event, she said. Very curated, very limited. I waited. I'd learned years ago that silence was the fastest road to what my mother actually meant. And Owen, she added, you know how he gets in formal situations. Owen, my partner, a man who repaired wooden boats and made furniture by hand. A man who had once driven 4 hours through a February ice storm to help a stranger re-roof their mudroom because the stranger's daughter had called his shop in a panic. That Owen, Mom. Are you telling me I'm not invited to my sister's wedding? I'm telling you it's better if you don't come. Not an apology. Not even a softening. Just the fact of it, delivered with the practiced certainty of a woman who had been making these kinds of pronouncements my entire life and had never once been asked to account for them. I turned the soup off, stood in the kitchen where I'd been standing, and tried to locate the last time my mother had called me towards something instead of away from it. I couldn't find one. Not one. This is where the story really begins, though. Not with the phone call, with the understanding that arrived right behind it. The recognition that I had been mistaking a pattern for wallpaper for 36 years, and the wallpaper had finally peeled back far enough that I could see the wall underneath. Before I tell you about the phone call that changed everything else, take a second to hit that like button if you're still with me. And drop a comment. I'm reading every single one. Now let me go back even further, because the phone call only makes sense once you understand what it was built on. Cora's dance recitals had professional photographers. Mine had my mother's disposable camera and blurry prints that never made it out of the envelope. Cora's high school graduation had 52 framed photos. I counted once, on an afternoon when the house was quiet, and I had nothing to protect myself with but the truth of what I was looking at. Cora and Mom. Cora with her friends. Cora and the dog. Not one of me. My college graduation, 6 years of double shifts and student loans, a degree in family mediation that I worked for in a way Cora would never have to work for anything. My mother forgot the date. She texted me the next morning, a single line. Did I miss it? No apology, no follow-up. Just a question mark that functioned like a period. When Cora got engaged, my mother flew across the country, booked a hotel, and organized a brunch for 40 people in a restaurant with valet parking. When I called to tell her Owen had proposed, the line went quiet. I counted that one. 6 seconds. Then, well, I hope you've thought about what you're doing. It took me years to understand where the favoritism lived in my mother's body. Cora looked like her, golden and photogenic and easy to present. I looked like my father, the man who left when I was 11. The man my mother had spent 25 years turning into a cautionary tale. Every time she looked at me, she saw him walking out the door, and she had never forgiven either of us for it. I found out about the photos in the garage on a rainy Saturday afternoon when I was looking for an old box of my grandmother's things. Behind the holiday wrapping paper and a broken floor lamp, I found a cardboard box, unsealed, sitting face down, inside every photograph of me that had ever been on the wall of that house. All of them. Removed from their frames, stacked, set aside. The frames themselves were still there, empty, gathering dust. Cora's photos were still on the mantel, centered, backlit. I put the box back, closed the garage door. Some evidence doesn't need a courtroom. It just needs you to stop pretending you didn't find it. The call from Cora came 2 days after my mother's call, which told me Cora had known before I did. There was the sound of ice in a glass when she picked up, mid-afternoon, which I'd learned meant she was doing that thing she did when she had a difficult conversation ahead and needed something in her hand. Sarah. Hi, I just wanted you to know the invitation situation wasn't my idea, Cora. I told Mom you should be there. I waited, but she makes a point about the venue. It's a certain kind of atmosphere, and Owen, no offense, he'd probably wear work boots. Owen had one pair of dress shoes. He'd bought them for my workplace holiday party 4 years ago, and cared for them the way he cared for everything he owned, attentively, without pretense. Cora didn't know that. Cora had never attended a single thing we'd invited her to, so there was very little she actually knew. We could do a girls' lunch after, she offered. Just us two. My treat. That was Cora's signature move. The consolation gift dressed up as generosity. I'd been receiving the wrong version of what I'd actually asked for my entire life. She'd been doing it since we were 9 and 7. Break my things, offer me something lesser in return, and call it kindness. I appreciate the call, Cora. Of course, love you. I hung up. And for the first time in my memory, I didn't feel sad about my sister. I felt something cooler and cleaner, not anger. Anger comes and goes like weather. This was more like the quiet at the end of a conversation when you finally stop trying to make someone hear you. I had spent 36 years translating my family's behavior into a language I could live with. She doesn't mean it that way. She's under pressure. They love me. They just show it in ways I can't always feel. I was fluent in that language. I could conjugate every excuse at speed. But sitting there in my kitchen with the soup cooling on the stove and Cora's voice still in my ear, I understood that I was done. Not angry done. Done. The kind where the decision has already been made somewhere inside you and your conscious mind is just catching up. Owen's workshop was at the end of a gravel lane that curved down toward the river. An old converted boathouse with a tin roof that had rusted from red to a deep brownish copper over the years. Inside, it smelled like linseed oil and cedar shavings and the warmth of wood that had been worked by patient hands. When I drove out there the evening after the phone call, he was sanding the hull of a 1938 sailboat he'd been restoring for almost a year. Oak and teak, bruised by decades of neglect, he was bringing her back the way he brought everything back. Slowly, by hand. Without rushing the process, I sat on an overturned crate and told him everything. He didn't stop moving. The rhythm of the sandpaper on the curve of the hull was the only sound between us for a long while. Your mom isn't a cruel person, he said eventually. She's a frightened one. I'd never thought of her that way. Frightened of what exactly? Of anything that doesn't match the story, she told herself. He wiped cedar dust from his forearm. People like that, they don't mean to hurt you. They just can't stop protecting the version of events where they're not the one who got it wrong. We talked about our own wedding. We'd been planning it loosely the way you plan something when the planning isn't the point. Here, in the workshop, something small. Owen had offered to build the tables himself. I'd been drying wildflowers from our neighbor Harriet's garden for months. No coordinator, no budget spreadsheet, no venue with valet parking, just the river and 100 people who knew our names and meant it when they used them. She said I'd upset the energy, I told him. At Cedar Ridge, Owen looked up from the hull. His expression was quiet and dry. Sarah, I haven't been invited to Thanksgiving in 3 years. I stopped keeping account somewhere in year 2. He said it the way he said most things, without bitterness. without making it into a scene. Just a fact he'd acknowledged and moved on from, the way you move past a house with a bad history. You see it. You don't stop there. I watched him go back to the hull. Underneath the damaged varnish, the original wood was still clean, still good. It just needed someone patient enough to stay. Cora's wedding was on a Saturday in March. I know because the 45-day countdown had been running in my mother's social media feed since mid-January. One of those little graphics with a ribbon border and a sparkle emoji, updated every morning with the same reliable enthusiasm of someone who had a performance coming and needed the audience to stay warm. I spent that morning weeding the raised beds Owen had built from reclaimed dock planks the previous autumn. The soil was still cold from overnight frost, and there was something deliberately grounding about having my hands in the dirt while my sister exchanged vows with a man I'd met twice. By mid-afternoon, the photos began appearing. Cedar Ridge Estate, in white draping and fairy lights. 280 guests, seated in rows of gilded chairs. A five-tiered cake that would have paid for our whole wedding with money left over. Cora in a gown that moved like water, smiling the smile I'd watched her practice in bathroom mirrors since she was 12. Calibrated. Held steady, I scrolled through the photos the way you drive past somewhere you used to live, recognizing the landmarks without needing to stop. Of the faces I could see, maybe 30 were people I actually knew. The rest were strangers. Brett's business network, my mother's book club, the neighbors she wanted to impress, people who existed at a social obligation distance that would never shorten into something real. That evening, my Aunt Bet called. She was my mother's younger sister and the only member of the family who still treated my existence as intentional. "I wished you were here, sweetheart," she said. Her voice was low, like she'd walked into a hallway to make the call. "Your mother is running a very expensive show." She paused. "It has no feeling. I've eaten $12 worth of shrimp and felt nothing." I thanked her. I meant it. Then I set the phone down and went back to the garden. The seedlings I'd planted that morning were already leaning toward the light, which struck me as instructive. At that evening, Cora posted a video of her first dance. 300 responses from people I'd never encountered. One from my mother, tagged with a heart emoji and the words, "My perfect girl." I closed the app. In 4 weeks, it would be my turn, and I had no intention of performing for anyone. I made my mother's invitation with my own hands. Cream card stock, blue ink. I pressed a dried sprig of rosemary from my kitchen garden into the fold. Because my grandmother had always said rosemary was for remembrance, and I wanted my mother to feel remembered, which was more than she'd managed to make me feel in years. I sealed it with wax from a candle Harriet had given me and addressed the envelope carefully. Owen watched me seal it. "You sure about this?" "She's my mother." "I know. That's why I'm asking." I mailed it on a Tuesday. By Friday, I had stopped watching for a response. Not because I'd given up, but because I had been managing my mother's silences long enough. Long enough to know how to breathe through them without expecting them to resolve on their own schedule. She called on Saturday. I was cutting herbs in the kitchen. "A workshop," she said, in the tone of someone reading a police report. "You want me to sit in a boat shed and watch you get married to a carpenter. He restores historic vessels and builds furniture by hand, Mom. And yes, there's a chair waiting for you in the front row, Sarah. Be reasonable. This isn't a proper. It's ours." She paused. I could hear the recalibration in the silence. The small mechanical adjustment of a person rerouting around an obstacle. "I'll consider it." In my mother's dictionary, "I'll consider it" had never preceded yes. It was a no with better manners, a no she could point to later and claim she had weighed. 10 days later, the invitation came back in the mail. Envelope unopened. On the front, in my mother's firm blue ink. "Return to sender." No explanation, no note tucked inside. Just those 3 words, written in the same blue as my own handwriting on the envelope's front, as if she'd reached for the same pen I'd used and written over my intention with her refusal. I stood at the mailbox for a while. The rosemary sprig had worked its way through a small tear in the corner and was clinging to the flap, dry and papery, still faintly fragrant if you pressed it. I pressed it between pages of my grandmother's cookbook. The one my mother had set out with the garbage the week after the funeral, and which I had carried home in my arms in the rain before the truck came. The binding was cracked. The pages smelled like vanilla and old paper. The margins were full of my grandmother's handwriting, small and practical, and full of the specific wisdom of a person who understood that cooking for someone was a form of love that didn't require explanation. The rosemary went between the pages for apple cake and the blank space after. Some things you keep because someone should remember they existed. 4 weeks before the wedding, Owen texted his entire contact list. Not a group message, individual texts, one by one, each one personal, getting the workshop ready. Come if you can. Bring whatever you've got. They came with everything. Marcus arrived first, a carpenter who'd known Owen since they were 19. With a truck bed full of reclaimed dock planks and a table saw he'd sharpened the previous night. By evening, he had built a dance floor on the workshop's concrete pad that was level and smooth and smelled like fresh. Harriet arrived mid-morning with her vintage lace curtains from 1971, folded in tissue paper she'd kept them in since her own wedding. She draped them across the workshop's open bay doors, where the afternoon river breeze moved them gently. The lace was yellowed and delicate, and turned the light into something that existed in old photographs. Priya, from my mediation practice, strung lights along the rafters on a ladder she'd borrowed from her brother. Her daughter, 11 years old and deeply committed to the project, threaded glass jars with wildflowers from Harriet's garden, lavender and chamomile, and small white daisies, and arranged them on every flat surface with the kind of editorial focus that impressed everyone who watched. Owen's friend Gus, who communicated mostly through nods and direct action, welded an arch from salvaged iron railing and installed it at the bow of the sailboat. It was imperfect and substantial, and exactly right. By the end of the first weekend, the workshop looked like a place that had been waiting for this purpose. String lights caught and moved on the water outside at dusk. The tin roof, which in rain sounded like applause, now framed the sky the way cathedral ceilings are designed to. Total spent $4,200. Food would be potluck. Music from Owen's speaker and his playlist. The cake, lemon olive oil from his mother Ruth's recipe, would be made by Ruth herself, who was 67 and had opinions about baking that she shared without being asked, and was always right. Harriet stood in the bay doors looking out at what we'd built and said, "This looks like a place where honest things happen." She was correct. My mother couldn't leave it alone. 2 weeks before the wedding, Aunt Bet called with the specific careful voice she used when she had something to say that she wished she didn't have to. "Your mother's been making calls," she said. "What kind of calls?" "To family. Extended family. She told your cousin Dennis that you're having some kind of breakdown. She told his wife that the workshop wedding is, and I'm quoting, a desperate cry for attention. The washing machine was running behind me in the laundry room. There's something stabilizing about background household sound in the middle of surreal news. It reminds you that the ordinary is still happening." She also called Ruth, Bet added, quietly. I stopped. She told her Owen wasn't stable, that his business was on uncertain ground, and he wasn't in a position to support a family. Owen's workshop had survived a difficult stretch 3 years ago when a major supplier dissolved, and he lost 6 weeks of sourced materials. He'd taken on jobs he didn't love, worked double shifts, rebuilt the supply chain himself. The workshop was standing, so was he. Whatever story my mother had constructed around that difficult year bore no resemblance to the one Owen had actually lived through it. That evening, Uncle Paul, my mother's brother, called without preamble. "Your mom phoned me," he said. "Told me you weren't well. Is that accurate?" "I'm fine, Uncle Paul. I'm getting married in a boathouse on the river in 2 weeks with 95 people who actually know us." A long pause. "Then, your mother has always had a generous relationship with the truth." He didn't elaborate, But I heard the thing underneath the statement. The sound of a man quietly moving from one column to another. Owen came home quieter than usual that night. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink and stood with the water running longer than he needed to. "Your mother called mine," he said. "I know." He turned off the faucet. "Ruth's not upset. She wants you to know that. But I want you to know she called. Some things don't need a response. They just need to be named. Ruth drove 4 hours from upstate on a Wednesday without calling ahead. She appeared in our driveway in a reliable old sedan with a thermal bag in the back seat and an expression that said she had already made a decision and was here to act on it. "I wanted to see the place," she said. "My son talks about it like it's where he learned to breathe." Ruth was 67, wide-shouldered and plain-spoken in a way that made you trust her within 5 minutes of meeting her. She'd raised Owen and his brother alone after their father died when Owen was 14, on a librarian's salary and whatever the garden produced. She had work-roughened hands, and she didn't soften her opinions, but she also didn't weaponize them, which was a distinction I had only recently learned to appreciate. I drove her to the workshop. She stood in the bay doors for a long time, without speaking, looking out at the river, the string lights, the dance floor. The arch Gus had welded at the sailboat's bow, the lace curtains moving in the river wind. Then she walked to the front row, found the chair with Harriet's name card, and nodded once. "This is an honest wedding," she said. She sat down in Harriet's chair, like she was testing a thing she intended to stand behind. Then she looked at me. "Your mother called me. She wanted me to believe my son wasn't ready. I told her my son built a birdhouse when he was 13 that is still standing in my backyard. He'll build you something that holds." We sat on the dock with iced tea, and I told her everything. The calls, the invitation, the returned envelope, the photo box in the garage. Ruth listened without interrupting, which is rarer than people acknowledge. When I finished, she said, "You remind me of someone who's been doing other people's math their whole life. Maybe it's time to start doing your own." Before she drove home the next morning, she had run 3 test batches of the lemon olive oil cake in my kitchen and made notes in the margin of my grandmother's cookbook, in Ruth's own handwriting, adjustments for altitude, a trick with room temperature eggs, a small circle next to the olive oil measurement with the word "more" written beside it. On the drive home, she texted, "Save me the chair next to the woman with the vintage curtains. She sounds like my people." Isabel Vega showed up at the workshop on a Thursday afternoon with a camera bag and a notepad. She was 29 and a reporter for the regional paper, writing a series on local small businesses that had survived the last decade. Owen's workshop was on her list. A brief feature from a town council meeting 2 years ago had put it there, and she'd expected to photograph boat hulls and talk about supply chains. Instead, she walked into string lights and mason jars and lace curtains and wildflowers and the unfinished architecture of something genuinely beautiful. "Are you getting married in here?" she asked, looking up at the rafters. "3 weeks," I said. I was writing name cards at the long table near the door. Her eyes moved across the workshop, the sailboat, the dance floor, the clothesline I'd strung between 2 maple trees outside the bay doors where we'd be asking guests to write notes during the reception. "Can I ask about the wedding for the piece?" Her voice had shifted. "This is a better story than supply chains." I told her the short version. "Getting married here because this was where our life was. 95 people, everyone chosen by memory. Potluck food, homemade cake, music from a speaker." She asked if she could film the ceremony. "Light equipment, no disruption, just a few minutes of the event and the venue." I said yes, not because I wanted coverage. Because Isabel looked at the workshop the same way Harriet had, like she was seeing something she'd been told didn't exist anymore, and was relieved to find out she'd been misinformed. "This is going to be a good story," she said. I assumed she meant the small business profile. She was already past that, but I didn't know it yet. And I think it was better that I didn't. If I had understood what her camera would set in motion, I might have said no, or I might not have. Some things are meant to be seen by more than 95 people. The afternoon light caught the sailboat hull and turned it gold for a moment before moving on. The day continued. The cracks in Cora's perfect wedding came through Bet, who had a gift for delivering difficult information gently but completely. There was a scene at the reception, she said. Cora and your mother. I was sitting on the workshop dock. The rain was soft, the kind that taps on a tin roof in patterns you almost want to transcribe. Prescott's mother cornered Patricia at the dessert table, Bet continued. She wanted to know who half the guests were. It turned out your mother had invited her book club, the neighbors, the women from her Thursday yoga class. People Cora had never met. It's over 60 guests who were there because Patricia wanted an audience for a production she'd been directing for 2 years. Cora confronted her in the bridal suite. Bet said she could hear it from the hallway. You invited your entire social calendar. This was my wedding, Patricia's response. I paid for a third of this. I can fill the chairs how I want. I closed my eyes. The rain on the tin roof was steady now, Bet said. I watched two women fighting over a production. Neither of them could stop performing. Neither one of them thought to ask what the thing was actually for. I didn't feel vindicated. I'd expected to, maybe, and the absence of it surprised me. What I felt instead was a sadness with more than one person in it. Sad for Cora, who had traded something real for a spectacle and was discovering the spectacle had its own terms. Sad for my mother, who had been performing so long she'd forgotten. There was an audience for something other than the performance, but I had my own house to build, and mine was going to hold. I want to pause here for a second because I keep thinking about the name cards I wrote that week. 95 of them, and every single one represented a moment when that person showed up when they didn't have to. If you've ever made a list like that, not an obligation list but a gratitude list, tell me in the comments. Hit like if you're still here. There's more coming, and the part about what my mother did when she finally saw the video, I think you need to stay for that. The dress was in a small vintage shop downtown, the kind where the owner knows every garment's provenance. I didn't call my mother to go with me. I called Harriet. She wore her reading glasses on a chain and carried a pressed handkerchief in her cardigan pocket, which told me she'd already decided she was going to cry and had come prepared. I tried 3 dresses. The third was ivory with small lace detail at the cuffs and a neckline that sat just below the collarbone. The hem was tea-length. It looked like something from a photograph of a wedding that had actually happened between two people who meant it. Oh, Harriet said. Just that syllable, with her hand pressed flat against her sternum. She stood and walked to me and began doing the buttons up the back. Small fabric-covered buttons that required patience. She did each one separately. I buttoned my daughter's dress 18 years ago, she said quietly. Different wedding, different decade. Her daughter had moved across the world years ago, and they existed in a silence that Harriet kept folded carefully and didn't speak about. I never thought I'd do this again. I looked at myself in the shop mirror. No makeup artist, no photographer circling, no mother adjusting my veil and saying what a mother says. Just me and Harriet and a 100-year-old mirror with a small chip in its lower corner. The tears came for my grandmother, who had died 7 years ago, and who would have sat in that shop chair and wept without embarrassment. She would have said, "That's my girl," and she would have meant the whole person when she said it, not the presentable version, not the version who looked like someone else. The whole person. Harriet fastened the last button and stepped back. "You look like someone who's done deciding," she said. She was right. That was exactly what I looked like. My mother came to the house without calling, 2 weeks before the wedding. She appeared at the door the way she appeared at everything, unannounced and already arranged, with a leather-bound photo album pressed against her chest, like evidence she intended to present. "I've been thinking," she said, stepping inside before I'd fully opened the door. "There's still time to do this properly." She set the album on the kitchen table and opened it. Cedar Ridge Estate. White draping. 5-tiered cake. 280 chairs. Cora in her gown. This is what a wedding should be, she said. I know people. I can make calls. I leaned against the counter and let her talk. I'd learned years ago that interrupting was slower. She preferred monologue dressed as conversation, and listening to the end was more efficient. She went through venues, caterers, a color palette she'd already been thinking about. And I understood, while she talked, that she wasn't offering help. She was offering management. The same management she'd been extending to Cora's entire life. Control that didn't ask what you wanted because it had already decided. Mom, I said, when she paused for breath. This wedding is planned. Every chair has a name, but none of those people are family. I looked at the kitchen where Owen and I had painted the walls ourselves the previous spring, the shelf he'd built for my grandmother's cookbook, the window where Harriet's garden was visible, rosemary and chamomile coming back through the frost. All of them are family, I said. Just not yours. Something moved in her face, not anger, something more honest. The expression of someone who has walked up to a door they assumed was theirs and found it doesn't open from the outside. She left without finishing her coffee. The photo album stayed on the table. I opened it that night. Every page was Cora. Cora and Prescott, Cora and Patricia, the estate, the ice sculpture, the guests I didn't know, 280 strangers arranged in rows, and then the gaps, pages with the little white corner mounts holding empty air. Every photograph that had ever included me, systematically removed. Not damaged, removed, carefully, completely, with intention. I closed the album and put it in the storage room next to the box from the garage. Things my mother had edited out of her own narrative. I'd become a cataloger of them without meaning to. 10 days before the wedding, I walked through the workshop alone in the hour before dusk. The string lights hummed with a warm frequency that was already becoming familiar. Wildflowers in their glass jars, refreshed that morning. Priya's daughter had taken it personally. She arrived every other day, with new cuttings from Harriet's garden, without being asked. The dance floor was sealed and smooth. The clothesline hung between the two maples outside the bay doors, wooden clips in a row, blank cards in a basket underneath. A cup of pens, the sailboat stood at the far end of the workshop. Owen had finished her varnish the previous week, and the result was the original, wood, talking again after 60 years of neglect and silence. He'd built a platform at her bow where we'd stand to say our vows. I walked between the rows of chairs reading the name cards. Harriet Tillman, front row left, next to Ruth Gallagher. Two women who owed me nothing and had shown up with their whole selves anyway. Uncle Paul, third row, RSVD with a phone call. I'll be there. Tell me where to park the truck. Coach Drummond, my high school softball coach, fifth row. He'd driven 5 hours to attend my mediation certification ceremony because no one else from my family had. He'd sent his RSVP with a note. Wild horses couldn't keep me. And then the empty chair. Front row, right side. The name card read Mom. Part of me wanted to pull it, fold the chair, reclaim the space for someone might actually sit in it. But Reed had said something that stayed with me, and Owen said the same thing in different words. Leave it there, not for her, for you, so you know you didn't close the door. I left the chair. I didn't change the name card, didn't add a note, didn't soften it or make it into a gesture, just left it as it was. A chair, a name, a space that was always there. Outside, fireflies were beginning along the waterline. The river moved slow and dark and easy. And somewhere in that quiet, the workshop stopped being a venue and became what it had always been underneath the tools and the timber. A place where something honest was happening. The rehearsal potluck was on the dock on a Thursday evening. No microphone, no assigned seating, no printed menu. Harriet brought bread she'd baked that afternoon, still slightly warm. Ruth's trial version of the lemon olive oil cake appeared, which she insisted was not finalized, and which everyone ate 2 slices of. Marcus brought a slow cooker of stew he'd been tending since morning. Gus showed up with smoked fish he'd caught himself, without mentioning he was going to do that. When people wanted to speak, they just stood up from wherever they were sitting, Marcus first. Sarah once mediated a 6-month standoff between two contractors on a shared renovation. By the time she was done, they were splitting tools and grabbing lunch together. That's who you're marrying into, Owen Coach Drummond. I coached Sarah when she was 15. She wasn't the fastest on the team, and she didn't pretend to be. She was the kid who stayed after to help the other kids. Every practice. She still does that. Ruth, standing with her glass of iced tea. My son rebuilt a broken boat he found abandoned on a dock that was scheduled for demolition. Most people would have walked past. He saw what it could be. That's how he sees things. That's how he sees her. Owen's toast was the last one. He stood at the edge of the dock where the planks met the grass. Sarah is the first person who ever walked into my workshop and didn't see a mess. She saw where things were going. The cornbread was gone. The citronella candles were guttering. The river was doing its soft, persistent thing against the pilings. I didn't give a speech. I held Owen's hand under the table and looked around at the faces. 95 names on a piece of brown craft paper. Every one of them a story about why they were here. That night, my phone buzzed. Cora. 4 words, no punctuation, heard about the boathouse. I read it. Put the phone face down on the nightstand, let it be what it was. The morning of the wedding I woke before the light shifted. Owen had already gone to the workshop. He'd texted at 5. At the shop. Last things. He had a habit of needing to touch every surface before something important. Like a pilot who checks the aircraft not because he doubts it, but because the checking is part of how he honors it. I made coffee. Stood at the window. The sky was moving from night into the pale preliminary blue that doesn't make promises. June light in this part of the state is honest. It doesn't hide anything or flatter anything. It just shows you what's there. Harriet arrived at 7 with a bouquet she'd assembled from the garden before 6. Rosemary, chamomile, baby's breath, 1 stem of lavender. For remembrance, she said, and for your grandmother, who would want to be here in whatever form she can manage. She helped me into the dress. The buttons up the back, one at a time. Her hands were steady. She'd practiced on the dress form at the vintage shop, she admitted later. She'd wanted to get it right. She fastened the last button, stepped back, and looked at me in the mirror. You know, she said, when I buttoned my daughter's dress 18 years ago, I thought I'd burst with it. She paused. You look real. She said it the way she meant it. Not as a consolation, as the highest thing. Real was better than beautiful. I'd spent my whole life being told I was the lesser version of something. Real was something else entirely. My mother didn't call. The phone sat on the bathroom counter in the quiet, where a mother's voice was supposed to be. I'd left space for it the way you leave an empty chair. It came and went. I picked up the bouquet. I nodded at Harriet Ridditti, not prepared, not braced. Ready. Finished waiting for someone else's permission to walk into my own life. The workshop held 95 people in chairs, curved gently toward the sailboat's bow. The bay doors were open to the river. A breeze moved Harriet's lace curtains in slow, steady waves. The wildflowers had opened in the warmth of the morning. The string lights hummed. There was no procession. I walked in through the side entrance, the way I'd been entering Owen's workshop for 3 years. Like I belonged there, because I did. Owens was at the sailboat's bow, wearing a white button-down and the dress shoes he'd owned for 4 years, and polished twice a month, because that was how he maintained things he cared about. When he saw me, he didn't cry. He just nodded. The quiet, certain acknowledgement of someone watching something arrive that they built toward. Our vows were short. I'd written them on a card but didn't need it. You never asked me to be a different version of myself. You never edited me. You never removed me from the frame. You handed me tea in the dark and sat down next to me, and that was everything. Owen cleared his throat. Sarah, you showed me that a workshop without someone in it is just a building, and a boat without a name isn't finished yet. You're the name. Harriet was crying before he finished. Ruth had her hand on Harriet's arm and was crying too, which Owen later said had never happened in the whole of his remembered life. Uncle Paul clapped first. 3 rows back, both hands, deliberate. The ceremony was 18 minutes, no ice sculpture, no gilded chairs, no 280 strangers who couldn't pick me out of a room. 95 people who knew us, and one empty chair in the front row that said more than any speech could have. Isabel's camera was on a tripod near the tool bench, quiet, steady. I'd forgotten she was there. I wouldn't forget for long. The reception moved from the workshop out to the dock and onto the grass in the way that things move when a space can't contain them. Potluck dishes covered every table. Harriet's bread, Ruth's cake, which she declared final that morning and which proved the declaration. Marcus's stew, a tray of handmade dumplings from Priya's mother that nobody had expected and everyone appreciated. Gus's smoked fish, which disappeared first. Owen's playlist came from a speaker propped against the workshop wall. Acoustic guitar, old soul, the kind of music that fills space without crowding conversation. People danced on Marcus's cedar floor. Ruth and Harriet sat in the front chairs that nobody had moved and shared a piece of cake, and talked with the ease of people who had been introduced at exactly the right moment in their lives. The clothesline was what I hadn't predicted. I'd strung it between the two maples as a late addition. Clips, blank cards, pens in a basket. Write something, hang it, or don't. No requirement, no announcement, just the option. By 8:30, the line was full. I walked it by lamplight reading, "You shoveled my path every winter for 4 years without being asked." Harriet, it was always you. You stayed late on the phone the night my mother was in the hospital. I never told you what that meant. You fixed my ceiling at cost because you knew I couldn't afford market rate. You said we'd sort it later. We never did. You never asked. I flew in from overseas. Some trips are just necessary. A card near the end, written in an unfamiliar hand. I came as a +1. I don't know either of them well, but I have never been at a wedding where I felt this much. Please tell me what they did, and I'll try to do the same thing. I stood on the dock at 8:30 and looked at the river. Black and smooth in the last light. The string lights made small gold circles on the water's surface. Upstream, somewhere, there was a Cedar Ridge estate, where someone else's performance was ending. Here on this dock, there was potluck food and handwritten notes, and a husband who smelled like cedar, and the faint, sweet undertone of lemon olive oil, and every single person who had come because they chose to. That was all. That was the whole thing. 3 days after the wedding, Isabel called while I was unpacking gifts in the kitchen. "The article went up this morning," she said. "That's lovely," I said. I was wrapping a mixing bowl in its tissue. There's a 4-minute video with it. The ceremony, the venue, the notes on the clothesline, the varnish on the sailboat at sunset. She paused. "It's at 60,000 views." I sat down. The mixing bowl was still in my hands. My editor wants to pitch it to regional platforms. And Sarah, the clip, it has momentum. Something about it. People aren't stopping. By noon, it was at 120,000. I watched the count climb on my phone like a thermometer, responding to something it hadn't expected to be asked to measure. Comments were coming in faster than I could read them. "This is what a real wedding looks like. I've attended 12 weddings that cost 10 times this and felt nothing at any of them. That empty chair. Who was supposed to sit there?" The empty chair. Isabel's camera had lingered on it. 3 seconds. Long enough for the name card to be legible in the frame. Mom. Just that one word. Just the absence of the person it was for. By evening, 240,000 people had watched our ceremony. By the next morning, 500,000. I didn't know how to place that number inside my life. I had built a day that was small and intentional and deeply private in its own way. A thing made of handwritten cards and rosemary sprigs and a neighbor's lace curtains and a cake Ruth had driven 4 hours to make. And now the internet was doing what it does, turning something intimate into something enormous, something personal into something collective. It wasn't wrong. It was just unplanned. Owen came in from the workshop around 10, leaned over my shoulder, read the number on my screen. "How many?" 450,000. He kissed the top of my head. "You've always been underrated." I laughed. But there was something tightening in my chest because I knew who would see it next. I knew the algorithm doesn't ask for your permission before it shows things to the people you'd least have chosen. And somewhere in a house that smelled like performance and careful maintenance, my mother was about to watch her excluded daughter become visible to 3 million people she'd never asked for. By day 5, the video had crossed 3 million views. A women's network with 900,000 members shared it with the caption, "This is what it looks like when a wedding is built instead of staged." A radio host in Tennessee mentioned it during her drive time slot. The workshop bride, people started calling me, a title I hadn't asked for and wasn't sure how to carry. The story that traveled fastest wasn't the venue or the vows or the potluck. It was the chair. Bride leaves empty chair for mother, who refused her invitation. That was the headline, not the one Isabel had written. Isabel's piece was careful and specific and full of actual context. But headlines don't carry context. They carry the nerve, and this one hit a root. My phone became something I kept at arm's length. Interview requests, messages from strangers, wedding publications wanting to feature what they called the anti-wedding. I declined most of them. I hadn't built that day as a statement. I'd built it as a life, but one comment made me stop. Buried in a thread on the Women's Network, from a woman named Angela, 54 years old. Profile photo of a beach somewhere gray and northern. My mom did this to me too, 18 years ago. She told me my husband wasn't from the right kind of background. She didn't come to my wedding. We had 35 people in a backyard. No video, no article, nobody saw. Seeing your chair made me feel like I wasn't crazy after all. Thank you. I read it 4 times. Then I read the replies beneath it. Hundreds of them, women in their 40s and 50s and 60s, sharing the same story in different words. Excluded from their own milestones. Told they'd upset the atmosphere. Told they'd ruin the energy. Told the person they loved wasn't the right kind. 3 million people had watched my wedding, and the thing they remembered most wasn't the dress or the vows or the river at sunset. It was an empty chair, a single piece of furniture, holding nothing but the weight of a question nobody wanted to answer out loud. Why wasn't she there? Sometimes the loudest thing in a room is the space where something was supposed to be. Cora texted first, 5 words. No punctuation, Mom saw the video. No congratulations. No, the ceremony was beautiful. Just a status report delivered with the emotional depth of a weather update. Uncle Paul called 2 hours later. His voice was different from every other time he'd called me. Thicker, slower. Your mother watched it 9 times, he said. She called me after the 3rd. She was crying, Sarah. The clock on the wall was ticking. I'd never noticed it tick before. She keeps saying she was supposed to be in that chair, that it was her chair. I waited. I told her, Diane, it was always your chair. You chose to send it back. A pause. She didn't argue with me. In 40-some years, I've never known her not to argue. The phone rang again 20 minutes later. My mother's name on the screen. I answered on the 4th ring. Why did you put a chair out for me? Her voice was stripped of the management I'd been listening to my entire life. Underneath was something smaller and younger, the voice of a woman who had been constructing something for decades and had just watched 3 million people look at what was built and find the gap she'd left. Because I wanted you there. I always wanted you there. I just stopped asking. The silence lasted long enough that I could hear the clock again. Those people in the video, she said. Those people really came for you. Everyone. Another silence. Longer. And then, before she hung up, right before the click and the quiet, I heard something I hadn't heard from my mother in decades. A sound she couldn't manage, couldn't perform or position or arrange. Just a sound. Raw and involuntary. The kind that happens when something you've been building for a very long time falls. And there's no audience for the falling except yourself. I put the phone down. Owen was in the doorway. 2 cups of tea. She cried, I said. He sat next to me. Neither of us spoke for a while. Some things need time more than words. 2 days later, Bet told me that Patricia had read Isabel's full article. the version with the sourced quotes beside each guest's name. Harriet Tillman, neighbor, brought meals during every illness for 7 years without being asked. Marcus Webb, friend, donated a full weekend of labor to build the dance floor. Coach Drummond, former softball coach, drove 5 hours to attend a mediation ceremony when no family member could. Ruth Gallagher, partner's mother, drove 4 hours the week of the wedding to meet the bride she hadn't yet and baked the cake herself. My mother had read each entry the way you read something you were not expecting to be implicated by. Slowly, returning to certain lines, sitting with the accumulation, Bet said she called Cora afterward. Did you read the article? Patricia said, Cora's response. So what? She got lucky with the internet. Our wedding was 3 times the size, bigger, Bet said. Not better, Patricia went quiet, not the strategic quiet she deployed when planning her next move. A different quiet, the kind that happens when something you have been building with great effort gets measured next to something built with care and lemon cake and $4,200, and your effort doesn't win. I don't know what happened in my mother's house that night. I wasn't there. I only know what Bet heard from Paul, who heard it from Patricia herself, that she didn't call anyone to explain, didn't spin, didn't reach for her phone to work the narrative. She just sat there, alone, learning what it felt like to be the one on the outside, looking at something that was going on without you. The letter arrived on a Thursday, 9 days after the video reached 3 million, plain envelope. Her handwriting on the front, but different from the return to sender she'd sent back weeks before. That handwriting had been certain and firm, a door being closed. This was something else. The letters leaned like they'd been written by a hand that wasn't sure it had the right to be writing. I opened it at the kitchen table. I watched the video 9 times. That was the first line. No greeting, no salutation, just the fact, placed first. Each time I watched it, I noticed something I'd missed before. The second time, I saw the curtains at the doors and thought they looked like the ones my mother had, your grandmother. I gave those curtains away when we sold the house, and I've regretted it. The fifth time I read the notes on the clothesline, the ones the camera showed, I recognized 3 people. 3, out of everyone there. The seventh time I counted the chairs. She'd stopped writing mid-sentence. I could see where the pen had lifted and set back down, leaving a small blue dot. The ninth time I just looked at the chair, then 4 more lines, each shorter than the previous. I don't know how to undo what I've done, but I know the chair was real, and I know you left it for me. I should have been sitting in it. No, I'm sorry. No, I love you. No accounting for the years of photographs removed, the invitation returned, the phone calls made behind my back, the photo album with the gaps. Just this. An acknowledgement that the chair existed, that it had her name on it, that she should have been in it. It was the closest my mother had ever come to saying something true about herself. I read it 3 times. Then I tucked it into my grandmother's cookbook, between the page for apple cake and the margin where Ruth had written her adjustments. Next to the rosemary sprig from the returned invitation, I didn't write back. Not because I had nothing to say, but because some doors need to be left open without being pushed. If she walks through it, it has to be on her own feet. 4 months after the wedding, the video was at 4.1 million views, and I had stopped counting. Owen was back in the workshop, where he always was, sanding and measuring and talking to wood the way some people talk to animals, with patience and low expectation of being answered and genuine affection for the process. The sawdust was back, the smell of linseed oil, the rhythm of measure and mark and cut. My mediation practice had grown. Not directly because of the video, but not entirely unconnected either. 3 clients had mentioned the video when they called for intake. One woman said, "I saw your wedding." I figured if you could deal with that kind of calm, you could probably help me talk to my landlord. I didn't argue. Ruth and Harriet had become friends, real friends, the kind who call each other on Tuesday afternoons for no reason and have conversations that are entirely their own. Ruth drove down once a month now. They sat on Harriet's porch. I wasn't privy to what they talked about, Owen called them your two mothers when he thought I wasn't listening. I didn't correct him. Cora, silence. Complete and total. She hadn't reached out since the forward text. She existed in the space between where the story was and where the next chapter hadn't started yet. I didn't chase. Some people need to arrive at the door themselves. Pushing only makes them deadbolt it from the inside. Patricia, one text, 3 weeks ago. Just this, Ruth's recipe, the lemon olive oil cake. Is that something you'd share? I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a bridge. It was something smaller and possibly braver. An acknowledgement that Ruth existed, that her recipe existed, that there were things in my world that my mother didn't have access to, and for the first time, she was asking instead of dismissing. I forwarded it to Ruth. Ruth sent back the full recipe within the hour. At the bottom of the message, a note: tell her the trick is room temperature eggs and good olive oil, and that the cake is better if you don't rush the cooling. I made peach cobbler on a Saturday afternoon when the light was coming in sideways through the kitchen window. My grandmother's cookbook fell open in the way things fall when you've handled them for years and they know where to land. The binding was cracked, where I'd rescued it from the curb 7 years ago. The pages smelled like vanilla and old paper, and the specific warmth of a house that had fed people for decades. It fell open between peach cobbler and apple cake, the page where I'd pressed the rosemary from the returned invitation. And beside the rosemary, tucked like a bookmark, my mother's letter, folded twice, and on the page beneath them, in my grandmother's faded pencil at the margin beside the cobbler recipe. For when company comes and you want them to stay. She'd always understood that cooking for someone was a kind of love that didn't need to announce itself. Peel the peaches, butter the dish, make the kitchen warm, make them feel like the table is better with them at it. I looked at the cookbook, its layers, my grandmother's pencil, Ruth's blue ink, the rosemary, my mother's letter, uncertain and late and real, 4 women's handwriting in one book. 3 of them had shown up. One was finding her way. I started peeling peaches, the kitchen filled with the smells of summer fruit and brown butter, and something baking that you don't need to dress up. I called Harriet. Come over. Bring nothing. I set the table for 4. Owen, Harriet, Ruth, who was visiting, me. When the cobbler came out of the oven, I cut 5 pieces. I left the 5th on a small plate beside the cookbook, old habit. Or hope. Hard to say which sometimes. I went back to the workshop one evening in October, long after the summer was over, and the video had settled into whatever it was going to be for good. The string lights were still up. Owen had left them because he liked how they looked at night, and because taking them down would have meant admitting something had ended. The wildflowers had dried in their jars, petals curled and brown and quietly lovely, in the way things are lovely when they've done what they were meant to do and aren't pretending. Otherwise, and the chairs had been stacked against the wall, all except one, front row. Right side, the name card was water-stained now from a night the bay doors had been left open in the rain. But the word was still there, Mom, blue ink, unsigned. I sat in it. The river was doing what rivers do in October, taking its time, remembering its depth. Through the open bay doors I could see the dock, the maples, the mailbox that had never matched the house, and our kitchen window lit up warm, Owen moving inside it, making dinner the way he made everything. Without rushing. Without pretending the process was less important than the result. My mother said I'd upset the energy of a place. What I found was that I created my own. I sat in the chair for a while. I didn't plan anything, or compose anything, or make any decisions. I just sat where she was supposed to sit and looked at the world through the frame she would have seen. The river, the lights on the water, the sailboat with her name on her bow, the name cards of 95 people who chose to be there. The life her daughter had built without waiting for permission. Then I stood up. I left the chair. I didn't move it or fold it or take the name card. I left it facing the river, facing the open doors, facing the evening. Some chairs stay empty, not as punishment, not as invitation, just as evidence that there was always room. I walked back along the dock to the house. Harriet's rosemary was still blooming along the path, which surprised me every time, because I always forgot how long rosemary holds on after the rest of the garden lets go. The kitchen light was on, the warm, certain light of a room where something is always happening. The kind you can see from the other side of a field, from far down a road, from the middle of the river, the kind that says, "Come in, something's made, the table's set, thank you for staying with me through all of this." This story isn't about revenge, it never was. It's about choosing your own guest list, not just for a wedding, for the whole thing, the life. If you've ever had to leave a chair empty for someone who decided not to show up, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment. Tell me your version. Tell me about your chair. I read every single one. If this reached you, share it with someone who needs it today. And if you're new here, there's another story in the description. One I think you'll stay for. Until next time.